I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush. With me, as always, is your other host, Patrick Wyman. Pat, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be here once again.
I feel kind of awkward calling you my co-host. I feel like it's demeaning.
No, don't be demeaning. Everybody needs a co-pilot.
But we're both co-hosts. We co-host together.
Yeah, you know, I'm not too concerned about it either way.
When they
I'm
call
here every week.
When they call the second fight on the card the co-main event, it's kind of patronizing, isn't it? Because it's not the co-main event, it's the sub-main event.
Yeah, it's the second fight on the card, and we glorify it by giving it that co-main event billing.
It's the vice main event.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh boy. Before the show today, folks, Pat and I are just in a weird mood. We were just embarrassingly quoting Wire references to each other from The Wire. So just being people that would get their asses beat if they ever stepped onto the streets of Baltimore and talked that way. That was
Correct.
Just basically what we were doing.
Correct. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's important that we at least know that.
Yeah.
So we don't have any bad ideas about attempting to slip into some sort of vernacular.
I'm not going to go somewhere and actually, start quoting lines from a hardened drug dealer.
That would be a real poor decision.
I do feel like I fit in here, though, Pat, talking about MMA and boxing and kickboxing, and so today we're going to jump right into our actual element. And we're going to make this just basically a whole listener mail episode. It's a non-fight week. Neither of us feels particularly up to another episode of Styles Make Fights. So we're just going to kind of go and dig through our backlog of listener mail and find some of the questions that we've missed from the past, ones that we wanted to talk about but never really had the time, or just couldn't fit it into the larger scheme of whatever episode we happened to be doing. And we're going to talk about whatever piques our interest.
Yeah, and luckily we've got a really nice backlog of questions here. We've got some really insightful stuff. We've got 5 or 6 things that we're going to take a look at if we've got time. But yeah, without further ado, what do you think? Should we hop in?
We should. Actually, there's one more thing I want to do before we start. We have some people who donated to the show over the past couple weeks, and they deserve to be thanked. And we really, really need to institute some kind of giving people t-shirts policy down the line. Something, because some of these donations have been very, very generous, and we really appreciate it. So I want to thank Victor O., David Wright, James Kimball, who had a super generous donation. I won't embarrass him by naming the amount, but very, very generous indeed. Austin Joe, Daniel Valentine, our friend Luis Richard, as we now know how to pronounce it, and Crave One Design. Thank you, everybody, for donating to the show, helping to support us. It really helps us out to keep this thing on the air and free. Obviously, we only until very recently we were not making any money doing this. So you're basically paying for the show to be hosted. You're paying for the website. You're paying for the RSS feed and everything. So we do appreciate it. And we also have a cool sound effect, Pat.
We do. How stoked are we about getting to use the sound effect for the first time?
I'm very stoked. And since this whole episode will basically be listener mail, I can just use this and preface the whole show, and then I'll drop it in like the rap battle air horn effect throughout the episode, just to punctuate particularly nice comments.
Now, we just got to be very careful that this isn't our gateway drug to becoming a drive time
shock
FM.
Jocks.
Yeah, basically, where we just have a whole soundboard of awful sound effects.
Yeah, so we'll start the heavy bag, just to stay professional, we'll start the heavy bag with this sound effect, and then we will end it with a boing sound, just to keep it professional.
Perfect, yeah.
I think that's the best route to go. Okay, so thanks to Oxygen Addict, a Reddit user, who just basically took a little time out of his day to make this for us. We are now going to dig into the heavy bag and go to some questions. How did we agree we were going to do this, Pat? We shouldn't be having production notes to each other on the air, but...
Shit, I completely forgot. I don't know. Just throw it in. Just throw it in, Connor.
Okay. And this is the heavy bag. How's that sound?
I think that was a perfect segue. You know, we're still working out the kinks here, but that's okay.
Very professional. This is why we have to have random people make sound effects for us, because we don't even know how they work.
It's true. No idea.
Okay, so that was a really cool sound effect. I feel like we should play it again. Here we go. All right, so here's how it's going to happen. I'll introduce the heavy bag, and then we'll jump into our first question. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, now let's get ready to dig into the heavy bag. And our first question comes to us courtesy of a man known only as @snot_boogie, which is exactly the name that got us onto talking Wire references before the show. And Snot Boogie has a question for us. What was his screen name on Twitter, Pat?
There was just one name, Peter. And then the @snot_boogie handle. So his question is a really good one. So when watching a fight analytically, what's the best place to focus on? Head, hands, feet, or the space between the fighters? So how would you answer that, Connor? What do you look for?
Well, when it comes to actually scouting fighters, I've actually kind of taken your advice to heart. I know a while back you said that when you're putting together a scouting report, you look at where they like to fight, against the cage. Do they like to hold people against the cage? Do they like to be moving around the perimeter? Do they like to control the center? I think that's a great place to start when you're trying to kind of get an idea of a guy's overall style. But I've got to be honest, I still, to this day, have kind of an amorphous way of approaching fights when it comes to writing articles. Sometimes I'll be watching fights for weeks on end and then suddenly realize, oh, I haven't looked at these guys' footwork in a while. I'm such a detail-oriented analyst that I can get completely caught up in what their guard is doing or what their hands are doing or how their head movement looks, and then realize I haven't even talked about the angles that they're creating with their feet. So I think there are a lot of ways. I think you're more of a big picture guy, so maybe you'll have more sound advice here. What do you think is the best possible place to focus on when you're first looking at some fighters?
Okay, so generally speaking, when I'm watching a fight live, I try and focus on the space between the two fighters. So I try and pick a spot between the two guys and let my peripheral vision pick out what's happening with either guy. And then if I'm doing something specific, like when I write a preview article and I go back and I watch the film on a specific fighter, then I watch that specific fighter. And I usually keep my eyes on somewhere around their chest. And that's usually what I do in sparring, too, for that matter, is you let your peripheral vision pick out what's happening with their limbs. If you really want to dig in deep to something, then go back and watch something specific, whether it's the feet or whether it's their feet or what their guard's doing or what their head's doing or what their eyes are doing. But first watch, I'm almost always picking a spot between them. If I'm trying to just watch fights, pick a spot between them, and then if one guy is doing something, let your vision kind of drift. Mm-hmm. But by and large, try and keep it in between. But that doesn't work when you're trying to do something really specific. When you're trying to evaluate a fighter, you need to be watching that fighter and not what their opponent is necessarily doing.
Yeah.
So it depends on what I'm looking for in a fight. If it's for my enjoyment, then I'll let my eyes go wherever they need to go. But if I'm trying to pick stuff up, then I'm watching for specific things.
Yeah, and a lot of analysis is really the product of, I think fight analysis as it is today would have been impossible before recording. And particularly before people had the ability to easily go back and rewatch things or slow things down and freeze on certain things, because I think so much of analysis is not just watching fights, but watching them in a particular way. And so when Pat and I are working on articles, we slow things down, we go back. I'll often watch the same thing over and over to try and understand why a fighter is able to do what he's doing. How did he land that shot, or how did he slip this punch or whatever, and go back over and over and over to try and understand it. So I'm going to go ahead and say I will come up with a concrete answer, even though it's not how I always operate, because I think this is where I started when I first got into analysis. I looked at fighters' feet. Mm-hmm. I think that understanding position as it pertains to footwork is one of the best ways you can start to understand fight analysis. Footwork is just kind of the most essential thing, the most essential single area of skill. Everything that really matters in a fight, you can argue that it comes down to the feet, whether it's punching power, whether it's being in the right position to land your strikes, whether it's avoiding the strikes of an opponent. You can move your head and all of this. You can set things up by feinting with your hands and whatnot, but none of these things are going to work if the feet aren't in the right place. So if you can really watch a whole fight, and like if you're watching one fighter and you want to understand what he's doing, and you can watch his feet the whole time, you really start to come to some nice conclusions about why he's getting hit, why he's not getting hit, why he's landing what punches and when. It all starts to make sense when you understand, when you really focus on where his feet are at any given moment.
Yeah, if you can only watch one thing in a fight, watch a guy's feet. Everything you're absolutely right, Connor. Everything starts from there. So after a while of watching, you can get a sense for what a guy's feet are doing based on the rest of his body following that, without necessarily watching the feet specifically. Yes. So like if you see a guy falling forward into his falling forward, you can bet that he's just not bringing his feet with him when he punches, and you don't necessarily need to see his feet to know that that's the case.
Yeah. I do an awful lot of footwork analysis in which the feet aren't actually in the frame.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and a lot of that has to do with, pet peeve. The UFC's production crew, a lot of the time cutting the feet out of the shot.
It's not even just the UFC. It's just modern TV producers, whether it's American or otherwise. They don't like static shots, and they don't like wide angles. They like to be in tight in the action. For whatever reason, I guess they think it makes for a better viewing experience for modern fight fans. So, if every fight could be shot, or at least have the option to view like the Thailand Muay Thai angle.
Yeah, that's my favorite angle to watch fights from.
Where it's like 50 feet from the ring and you can see the whole ring at all times, and there's no close-ups. It's just wide angles of what the fighters are doing. And, from that angle, the referee's never really in the way. You never struggle to see what the fighter... You're basically in the best possible seat in the stands to view the fight. So
yeah,
I'm happy with
I think
that.
a lot of that in Thailand has to do with the fact that the fighters are almost interchangeable from the perspective of the audience. Like there are very few guys in Thailand who are like really stars or really draws in their own right. So you get a focus on the fight instead of the fighter.
I think it's also cheap.
That makes sense. You think it's also what?
I think it's also cheap.
Oh, yeah, also true. Well, you only need like one or two cameras.
One camera, usually. Like, it's cheap to have one camera sitting up in a specially ordained spot in the stands and just leave it there running for the live broadcast.
Yeah, and Thai stadiums, having been to Rajadarman, it is not exactly the highest tech approach you're ever going to find to stadium design.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we didn't really come up with an amazing answer. I say watch the feet. Pat says watch the space between them. Really, when it comes down to it, it's like anything in fighting. You get better at analyzing fights the more you try to analyze fights. It's a matter of experience, and you can get pointers and everything. But you hear that? There's a cat battle going on in the background. But at a certain point, you just have to put in the hours. And I think I'm a vastly superior analyst to when I first started doing this. I think I've got a much better handle on how to watch fights and how to describe what I'm seeing. And, at a certain point, that just comes down to the amount of time I've spent doing it at this point. It's been 2 or 3 years, I think, since I've been doing this professionally. So,
yeah, I mean, a lot of it at the end of the day comes down to pattern recognition, right?
Yes.
That like you realize that you've seen this before, you've seen that before. You may not necessarily know off the top of your head where you've seen it, or even necessarily whether it's important. You just know that you have, and so you've got it gives you a bigger and bigger store of comparisons to draw on.
Yes.
When you're doing your analysis, implicitly or explicitly, you may not necessarily know that you're drawing on this experience as you're evaluating something, but you do. So like, when I watch prospect film now, because I still watch, I don't do as much as I used to. I do more like scouting of UFC fights than I used to. But when I look at prospects now, it only takes me generally a few minutes to figure out whether somebody is worth continuing to watch, because you get so used to picking out the fundamentals, like things like footwork and are they getting weight transfer into their punches? What do their kicks look like from a technical perspective? How are they landing stuff? Do they know how to shoot a double leg? Do they know how to pass guard? Like, those are things like, when you do it enough, you can evaluate those things very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Like, you only need to see them do it once or twice to get a sense for whether they know how to do it.
I absolutely agree. Absolutely. Which is why once you've watched enough fights, you can, even just looking at it from a fan's perspective, you can watch a fight and then suddenly perk up and say, ooh, something really impressive is happening here. You know, even if you're not even... the example that's coming to my mind right now is in a fight with... who was Nico Musoke's last opponent?
Oh, God.
Not Taisumov, one of the other ones with a similar name.
Was it Yakovlev? Did he fight Yakovlev?
It wasn't Yakovlev. It was, and here we go. This is our most professional episode yet, and here we are Googling things in the middle of the episode. It was Tumenov, Albert Tumenov.
Oh, yeah.
And when I saw that fight, I was tweeting while it was happening, just kind of watching as a fan, just enjoying the proceedings. And I said, wow, amazing angles here by Tumenov. When he started in about the second or third round to counter Musoke's kicks and get inside his punches and take advantage by, you know, moving to the left and forcing Musoke to turn, hitting him while he was punching or hitting him while he was turning and trying to catch up. When I say that, it's because I've seen a lot of guys take angles, and I know what it looks like when a guy is using an angle. Not necessarily because I realized what he was doing. I had to go back and watch the footage and be like, okay, he's actually stepping to his left as Musoke throws and then countering his punches. You know, it's just kind of a thing where you watch it happening, and from experience you know that it's good.
Yeah, I mean, good example of that, the McGregor-Seaver fight, where McGregor cracks him with a left hand about 2.5 minutes into the first round, and it's from an inside angle, and you saw that happen, and you're like, oh, McGregor did something really, really interesting and really cool there, but you have to go back and watch it again to figure out exactly how it happened.
Yes.
But the pattern recognition, the immediate understanding that something interesting has happened is right there from the very start.
Yes. Absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, as kind of a follow-up to that, we've got another question on that. You know, when you break down, or this is from Cameron Dabbagh, Dabbagh. Sorry for butchering your last name.
I went super Gaelic in pronouncing it before the show. I was like Dabbagh.
really get that guttural sound in there at the end.
Yeah, Cameron Dabbagh.
Yeah, so his question is, you know, what are the things that you look for in terms of finding strengths and weaknesses in fighters' games? I assume that you have to look for patterns in what they do, but what else is important when scouting fighters?
It's a great question. And both Pat and I have done actual scouting reports, which I think is, you know, since he uses the word scouting so liberally, I'm going to assume he's actually interested in trying to find out, like, how to beat a fighter. Like when I do one of my gaps in the armor articles, or when I'm doing privately contracted work for a fighter and trying to explain what the weakness is in an opponent, why don't we talk about that specifically?
Oh yeah, sure.
So this actually, when we were talking about scouting, is when you first mentioned to me that you look at where a guy likes to fight first of all. Is that still something you do?
Yeah, absolutely. The very first thing that I look for in when I'm evaluating a guy's film is, first of all, if I'm doing private scouting work for somebody, first of all, I'm watching the film multiple times, right? I'm not just watching it once. The first watch, I'm just picking up whatever I see, and I'm just kind of randomly taking notes at things that stand out to me.
Yeah.
But it's the second watch through where I really start to try and identify specific things. And the first thing that I look for specifically is where in the cage a guy likes to fight and what direction he likes to move. So does he want to push his opponent close to the fence? Does he want to be out in the middle of the cage? Is he moving in a circular fashion, or is he more of a linear fighter? These are the things that I'm looking at immediately. I think those are the two most important things: is where are you in the where do you like to be in the cage, and what's your directionality of movement?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that really plays into our styles analysis of the past few episodes. I think that really when we do that, because that's exactly how I start too. Ever since you mentioned that to me, and this has been, I'll get into this in a bit, this has been kind of an adaptive process for me, starting to scout fighters as if I'm trying to plan for someone to beat them, because I've had to start looking at things differently than my natural inclination has me looking at them. But I think before we get into that, I want to say that looking at where a guy likes to fight and what way he moves, you're really kind of trying to find in inexact terms what is his style. And that's important because, as we've talked about a lot, when you're planning on beating a guy, you have to understand his mentality. You have to understand how to make him uncomfortable, how to make him break. And we've talked a lot about how styles are a product of mentality and temperament. So when you start to understand, oh man, you're not just looking at it saying he likes to fight coming forward. You're also saying he looks uncomfortable moving backwards. And he looks really good in open movement, but he looks scared when he's got his back pushed against the fence. You're trying to look for where he really doesn't, not just where his technique is lackluster or whatever, but where he doesn't like to be there. Because if you can have, in your scouting report, if you can suggest to the person who's fighting him that he put him in a position where he's uncomfortable, that hugely advances their chances of beating that opponent.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a lot of the time there's a fundamental misconception about what scouting is supposed to do. And I think this is true of all sports, but I think it's especially true of combat sports. And the way that MMA fans especially think about game planning is they think, well, it's about exploiting a weakness that a guy doesn't. What you're trying to do is figure out what a guy doesn't do well, and you're trying to figure out how to exploit that. When really, I think for the most part, you're doing the opposite of that. You are trying to figure out what they're good at, and you're going to try and figure out how to take that away from them.
Yes.
Right. So if you notice that, to use an example, when I scouted for Rafael dos Anjos when he fought Donald Cerrone, and the thing that became really apparent to me watching Donald on film was that he is an open space fighter. He is an out fighter, a very archetypal one. That he does not like to be backed up. He doesn't like to have his back to the cage. He's okay with you pushing him backwards. He's got some counters in his arsenal, even more so now than he did in midway through 2013. But kryptonite for him is having his back to the cage. But really, that's not so much about exploiting a weakness, because it's not like he's a terrible fighter when he's backed up. It's about taking away what makes him really good, and that's his ability to move in open space and find angles on his low kicks and take you apart a shot or three at a time. So if you can take that away from him, then suddenly you have drastically increased your chances of winning the fight. Not by exploiting something that they do poorly, but by taking away what they do well.
Yes, and speaking to breaking a guy's confidence, when you take away what makes him comfortable in the cage, you automatically... I mean, I watched that fight live, actually. I was pretty excited to know that you scouted for him because I got to see that fight live in Indianapolis. And it was absolutely... I mean, after that fight, I thought, boy, is Donald Cerrone ever going to be the same? Because he looked broken after the fight. Like, seeing him walk out of the octagon, he was not happy. And it was because Dos Anjos' game plan made him unhappy for 15 minutes straight. It made a guy who likes to build up to momentum and likes to be coming forward and likes to be in open space and dominating his opponent, it made him feel uncomfortable because he couldn't do any of those things. And it was because of the way that Dos Anjos fought him. And I think that's really... This also plays into the discussion that we had a while back now about strategists and tacticians. Mm-hmm. Because I personally think of myself as a tactician at heart. I like to look at little small details and technique. So when I first started writing articles, I was always very critical of technique because I was looking at the specific mechanics, and basically every fighter you ever watch has bad technique. That's really just that's the large and the small of it. That you're never going to see a fighter whose technique is perfect with more than maybe one or two things, because all of them are adapting their technique to their specific needs in the moment of the fight, and to what their style is, and to what feels right to them. So even if they have very strictly schooled technique, like somebody like Gennady Golovkin does plenty of things I don't really like technique-wise, and yet he's a very schooled Eastern European style fighter. Mm-hmm. It's just the way it is. So over time, I mentioned this before, I've been trying to be more of a strategist, and nothing forces you to do that more than doing a scouting report, where you can't just look at small details. The small tactical details are the last thing I look at when I'm doing a scouting report. The very last thing I do is come up with tactical suggestions. And the fun challenge of doing those is that you have to make your tactical suggestions based on what the challenger to this opponent is good at doing. You can't just say, oh, he's open for this. You have to say, okay, what does he have that plays on this opening? But before
and tactical things can change drastically. Yes. Because if there is a well-established pattern where a guy struggles at doing this specific thing, unless that guy's coaches are idiots, they too will have figured out that that's a problem, and a lot of the time they will have devoted effort to working on that.
Yes.
So I'll give you an absolutely concrete example of this. Excuse me. An absolutely concrete example of this. When I scouted Travis Brown for Fabricio Verdum, one of the things that I noticed really heavily on film was how much Brown struggled on clinch breaks, right? That like every time he broke the clinch, his hands would drop to his waist, and a lot of guys had success hitting him with his hands by his waist because, that's really easy to do when you break the clinch. So that was something that I suggested in this scouting report. And I know for a fact that Verdum worked on it pretty extensively. When it came to the fight, Verdum tried it once or twice, and every time he tried it, Brown had his hands up. Yeah. Brown had learned from his mistakes and closed that particular gap.
And so when you're coming up with a game plan, you can't bank on specific tactical openings. Rather, you have to design your tactics towards not like where is the guy weak, but like you said, how do you take away his strengths? What's he good at, and how can you avoid where he's good? And that is purely a strategic way of looking at fights, more than a tactical one. Like a strategist is still going to think of tactics, right? But the tactics are going to be fitting a strategy. Whereas if you let yourself be too much of a tactician, you're going to come up with things that don't actually play to your fighter's strengths or against the opponent's weaknesses. Strategy is all about, why am I doing this at this given moment? Tactics, if you get caught up in the how of tactics, how do I do this? Then you're going to start suggesting that, Fabricio Verdum shoot for double legs and then do this special technique to avoid Travis Brown's elbows. You know what I mean? Rather than, how can I not ever end up in a position to have that happen in the first place? Which is a much better way of approaching a fight.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so like, think about it like this. I don't know if we've used this example before, and we may have when we broke this fight down, but it's been a few months. But so like the difference between Andre Pederneiras and Duane Ludwig in the corners when Aldo fought Chad Mendes for the second time, like Ludwig is a quintessential tactician, and he's looking for answers to what Aldo's doing in the corner. And I don't know if it didn't occur to Ludwig or he just got so caught up in the technique, but he totally missed the fact that Mendes was having his best success when he pressured Aldo towards the fence. Yeah. And when Mendes stopped doing that, Ludwig didn't mention it again in the corner that I could hear for the rest of the fight. Like, it was like he had forgotten about it.
So what kind of things did Ludwig mention? Do you recall any?
A lot of stuff about where all those hands were, specific punches to throw. Okay. He wanted more circular movement. He wanted more angles, stuff like that.
Yeah, so
which is not bad advice.
Yeah, he was saying things like to use that takedown threat to set up the uppercut, or how to get Aldo's hands into this position. All of these things are not bad advice. They are all perfectly suited. They're all based on the evidence he had seen. It's all working off of data that had been acquired in the fight previously, and it's all good data. It's good analysis. But it's not necessarily the thing that Chad Mendes needs to hear at that moment, because if you shouldn't be expecting Chad Mendes to outbox Jose Aldo. You have to help Chad get into a position where his chances of outboxing Aldo become much, much higher. So you have to think, where is his chance of boxing Aldo successfully the best? Well, when Aldo's back is to the cage. Not, how can he outbox Aldo in his element? Because yes, you could think of techniques for Mendes to do that all day, but it's just not going to happen.
Or it's just not going to happen as much as it will reliable. In a more advantageous position.
Yes.
I think it's important, and MMA fans in particular are not great at this just because the fights tend to be pretty short. So we tend to think in terms of events rather than processes, and we tend to think in terms of single things rather than probabilistically. And doing this kind of like large scale analysis to come back to the original question that we were asked, like that is a much more a matter of thinking probabilistically. Like, so how do I take this thing from where, I have maybe a 30% chance of this working to where I have a 70% chance of it working, right? Like, it's not unthinkable that in an open space kickboxing matchup, Rafael dos Anjos beats Donald Cerrone 3 out of 10 times, or Chad Mendes beats Jose Aldo 2 out of 10 times. But when you take those guys out of their element and you back them up to the cage when you pressure them, suddenly that goes from being 2 out of 10 or 3 out of 10 to 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10.
Yeah.
So that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to maximize your chances.
Yes. And so as the strategist, to contrast with Ludwig, Pederneiras does give Aldo tactical suggestions. A strategist is not blind to what tactics are. A tactic is just a specific thing you do to win a fight. But his tactical suggestions are all from the mind of a strategist, of what is the highest, what gives us the best probability of continuing to win. And so, like, when Pederneiras sees Aldo's leg kicks getting checked, he doesn't think, all right, how can we set those leg kicks up? He says, okay, stop leg kicking. Let's focus on this for now. Let's press where we do have our advantage, and we'll come back to the leg kicks later when he's tired and he's forgotten about them. Which is brilliant. It makes total sense to have Aldo's an amazing leg kicker. So now that they're checking the leg kicks, they're expecting them. So just forget them. They're not working as well as they were. You could still land them, but the chances are higher that he's not going to be thinking about your boxing. So focus on your jab and your footwork, and then we'll kick him later when he's forgotten again. It's brilliant. That's strategy. And so when you're coming with a scouting report, you have to think of things that way. It's been a really fun challenge for me because, as I said, I really think I'm almost a pure tactician. But, you know, for example, when I was coming up with that game plan, this wasn't actually for Dos Anjos, but when I was doing my Gaps in the Armor article and basically scouting, coming up with a strategy to beat Anthony Pettis, I had to not only think of what does Rafael Dos Anjos do, but I had to think of why is Anthony Pettis uncomfortable in these situations, and in which situations are his strengths reduced the most? What's the safest way of beating him? Which, you know, it doesn't sound as simple as it's not as simple as it sounds, because you wouldn't think, oh, it's safest to exchange kicks with Anthony Pettis, and it's safest to stand in the pocket with a guy who hits that hard and throws shots that precise. But from the entire fight perspective, the safest thing to do is to push him and make him feel uncomfortable, make him sweat, make him worried, and then you can start to really make your own tactics work.
Exactly. It's about the aggregate, not the individual event.
Probability.
Probabilistic thinking.
I love that word. Probabilistic. Sounds like Kabbalah.
Yeah, dude. Have you read Nate Silver's The Signal and the Noise?
I have not.
So you would really like it, but it's all about probabilistic thinking, and not everything in there is perfect. But it's a really interesting investigation in terms of how you can think more probabilistically. It's a very helpful thing. I highly recommend.
So there you go. Anybody looking to make scouting reports or to scout fighters, read Nate Silver's. What is it?
The Signal and the Noise.
The Signal and the Noise. All right. Okay, well, why don't we take a break? We've been talking for about half an hour now, so why don't we take a break, and we'll come back and do some more questions after this. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials, but if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us, and like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. All right, folks, we're back after that very long first segment. And we've got some more questions for you. Oh, should we play the sound effect again?
I think we should play the sound effect again.
It's pretty dope. Okay, here we go. We're going to go right back to the heavy bag. And our next question comes to us courtesy of Eric Page, who asks, I shouldn't even say who asks, because there's always a preface to these questions, who says, I was watching a highlight of Ernesto Hoost leg kicks, and I noticed that he would kick the legs of his opponents while clinching with them, and sometimes just as he was about to break. Why do you think this is not seen in MMA? Why do you think, Pat?
So first of all, I would say we have seen it in MMA at least a little bit, right? So Shogun Rua Did it a couple of times that I can remember in Pride, and he did it when he fought Brandon Vera. He got into the clinch with Vera, and he leg kicked him from there. We just saw it about a month and a half ago when Al Iaquinta fought Joe Lozon in the finishing sequence. Iaquinta was tied up with him, was very, very close in, hit him with, like, I think a left hook, turned it into a collar tie, and leg kicked him while he still had the collar tie. So we have seen it. The thing is, the reason why we haven't seen it more is because it's really hard to do. It's one of the things that you see from very high-level kickboxers, and really more like Dutch-style kickboxers, is an ability to change the arc of their low kicks at close range to suit the angle and the distance that they're working from. Like, one of the great misconceptions that I think you see with a lot of fighters in MMA, and I know that I had it until I just threw so many low kicks that I figured out how to do this and had really good coaches who were really good at teaching low kicks, is there is not a single range from which you can low kick. There is not a low kicking range. There are a variety of ways that you can change the angle and the range of your low kick based on how you step, the angle that your body is at relative to your opponent, and the range that you're at. So you can be literally in the pocket with somebody, like glove to glove with somebody, and you can leg kick them from there. It's just a matter of finding the right angle and the right arc for your kick to do it.
It's the same as any strike. You can throw a jab from 6 inches away from somebody's face and land it with power. Miguel Cotto does that very well. And you can throw a left hook from really far away. Every strike can be adjusted to work at different ranges and angles. So absolutely. I think there may be... by the way, Mizuki Inoue is the other one that I had thought of who does this. She did it a lot in her fight with Beck Rawlings, if I remember correctly. Specifically when she had Rawlings against the cage, and she kicked her in the leg while she was pinned there, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, I think we could definitely stand to see more of it in MMA. It is a very useful thing to do. I think that we will see it more. It is a useful skill, and as the level of striking rises, I think that it's kind of a market inefficiency that we'll start to see filled.
Yeah, and now here's the two reasons I think it's not very common in MMA. One, as you said, it's not like it's impossibly difficult, but it's certainly not as easy as just kneeing someone in the thigh, which is very, very common in MMA. There's basically no instruction involved. If you hold someone against the fence and you see your fighter doing that and you say, okay, now knee him in the leg, he's going to do it without being told how. Just throw your point of your knee against their leg. It's going to hurt him, and it's easy.
With that, I actually disagree with that just a little bit, because there are more and less effective ways to knee somebody in the leg.
No doubt about that.
There's a way I was taught by you can just throw them kind of straight on if you've really got them pinned up against the cage, especially if you're digging the crown of your head into their chin or into their face somehow, like you're applying head pressure. You can just knee them straight on, like just throw it like you would a knee to the like a spearing straight knee to the body, and you can throw it the same way to the thigh, or you can like open your hip and pull your hip out wide and raise your hip and then drop your knee down almost laterally.
The round knee or the slapping knee. Thai fighters throw that to the ribs a lot, but
and this is a little different. It's not like with one of those Thai knees, you kind of you point your leg as it lands so that your foot is almost parallel to the ground a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And with these kinds of knees, you're just like raising and dropping dropping it down like you would like a pendulum.
Okay.
And it's extraordinarily painful. It's way more painful than getting kneed straight on. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's a smaller point of contact, more force concentrated on a small point just hurts more.
Yeah.
But there are, but still, yes.
I don't mean to imply that it's a skillless endeavor anymore. It's more that if you had to teach somebody to shoot a bow or to fire a gun, you would absolutely choose the gun, because it's not easy to be a marksman with either, but it takes a lot less training to just pull the trigger on a gun than it does to learn and build the strength to shoot a bow.
Yes, this is absolutely correct, and I really wanted to sneak that bit about the.
You just wanted to brag about how much you know about knees. I understand, Pat.
I do. Yes, that's correct. But I mean, it's kind of an interesting question, and I think that there's room here for a broader discussion of low kicking and MMA in general, because we were talking in the break before we went on air about the state of low kicking and MMA in general, and you raised the point, and I think this was a really good one, that there was a point where people were really, really into low kicks in MMA. That like there was like a huge revelation about
coincidentally around it started. The fascination started with Pedro Hizo, unsurprisingly, and I think it really hit its peak around the time that Shogun fought Lyoto Machida,
which not coincidentally was shortly before Jose Aldo just destroyed Uriah Faber's
yeah,
legs.
And absolutely around that time as well. I do want to say though, I said that they're easier, but I had one other thing to say about why I think they're less common before we get into just our whole low kick free for all. I think that there's probably something to be said for people who are good at kicking not being ones who are good at clinching. And so there's a big difference between clinching and kickboxing, where everybody can basically do the same array of limited things, especially in K1 kickboxing, where the heavyweights like Ernesto Host weren't fighting a lot of Thai stylists, or any, really. Where there you're safe to clinch up and then push the guy back and kick him in the leg as he stumbles backwards, which is a great technique. Whereas in MMA, if you're somebody who's good at kicking, the clinch is probably the last place you want to be.
Yes.
And so I think if we do see some people who are good low kickers, they're usually not, like Edson Barboza, not going to clinch with you. And he's one of the best low kickers around. Same with Jose Aldo. I'm sure Jose Aldo could kick from the clinch, but he doesn't like to fight from the clinch. And so I think we probably just don't have the opportunity to see it as much. Our best chance of seeing it is probably guys who start off as fantastic wrestlers like Johnny Hendricks, who then turn into fearsome low kickers. I wouldn't be shocked if we saw Johnny Hendricks low kicking people from and after breaking the clinch in the near future. It seems like a thing he'd be capable of.
Yeah, another guy, speaking of which, who would fit that mold that I bet would do this. And actually, I have seen him do this. I have seen him do this in a fight. Justin Gaethje, who fights Luis Palomino on the World Series of Fighting show this weekend. Justin Gaethje, a very good wrestler, a very good clinch fighter, will throw low kicks from the clinch occasionally.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. That is a good point, Connor.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you so much. You were saying we wanted to get into just kind of a wider discussion of low kicks. They were popular around that time. Like, people were really into the idea that low kicks were like the truest test of what makes MMA and, by virtue of connection to MMA, Muay Thai, the coolest martial arts. Where, like, you couldn't go into a YouTube comment section where somebody mentioned Taekwondo without somebody else douchily saying, oh yeah, well, how about when I low kick you? As if low kicks are the pinnacle of Muay Thai skill. They were really cool for a time.
Yeah, I mean, and the great irony of that is, of course, that you really don't see a whole lot of low kicking in Thailand for a variety of better and worse reasons. I mean, from a purely technical perspective, I'll quote Faraz Sahabi on this because he and I talked about it, is when everybody kicks like a horse, you tend to stay very light on your lead leg, which makes it much easier to check low kicks. And because also you have to worry about a lot of body kicks, you can check body kicks as well with the same kind of upward flick of your lead leg.
Yeah.
So it's much harder to kick a tie in the legs because of the stance, because of how attuned they are to your movements and to kicking in general. But then also, and I hadn't actually thought about this all that much, but you mentioned there's a scoring bit in there as well, right, Connor?
Yeah, the judges don't care about low kicks in Thailand. So much of scoring Thai fights, it baffles me because I never score Thai fights accurately because I look at them like a Westerner. But Thai judges emphasize things like the appearance of dominance, balance, and the selection of strikes. And so punches and low kicks are both seen as either undamaging or unskilled techniques in Thailand, so they don't really get a lot of preference in the scoring. A guy who... So really, you tend to... There are good punchers in Muay Thai, guys who box well. Not good punchers, good boxers. And there are guys who are very good with low kicks. And funnily enough, one of the gyms that's known for both is the Sitmonchai gym, where everyone's favorite action Thai fighter, Pornsanai Sitmonchai, that's the gym he fights out of, obviously, given his last name. And they both box very well, and they use their boxing to set up their low kicks. And but it's a very like a specific type, because if kicking someone in the body and kicking him in the legs is equally as difficult because they're good at checking, and the judges vastly prefer that you attempt one over the other, why would you really try to throw low kicks unless you're very, very good at scientifically setting them up and landing them, which Sitmonchai fighters typically are.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason you see so much emphasis on low kicking in like the Dutch style of kickboxing and in generally speaking what has developed and kind of through convergent evolution throughout the Western world into like international rules kickboxing is because all strikes are scored, right? Like it's not if a guy lands a low kick, you don't not score that because you don't think it's important. You may not place as much emphasis on it in your head as a judge, but it is a scoring strike, and a punch is a scoring strike. You know?
And it just in the same as in boxing, sometimes we tend to overvalue headshots and overlook body work. But nobody's ever going to say that a good clean shot to the liver doesn't count as much as a shot to the head. Objectively speaking, they have the same precedence in the scoring hierarchy. In Thailand, that's not true. There is very explicitly a hierarchy of strikes, and elbows and knees in the clinch, and body and head kicks are at the very tip top. And punches, either to the head or the body, and low kicks are at the bottom.
Yeah, it's better. They are better than doing nothing, but they don't count for much.
Yes.
Whereas in Western scoring criteria, those things count for a great deal more.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, and a lot of that, there are a lot of different reasons for this that we don't necessarily need to get into. But you know, if you watch a kickboxing match between an international rules kickboxing match between people who are very good, you're going to see a lot of low kicking, and you're going to see a lot of punches used to set up low kicks, and you know, like 2-3 low kick, 1-2-3 low kick, liver shot low kick. These are the staple combinations of Dutch style kickboxing.
Yeah,
and the reason, you know, I think we see a lot of bad low kicking in MMA. Like,
no
really,
doubt.
like really, really bad low kicking, and and stuff that you can't get away with in international rules kickboxing. Like you see a lot of, I mean, my pet peeves are guys who don't step, who don't move their head offline, and who drop their hands when they throw low kicks. Because you know, you chop your hand down in a low kick, and that gives you a little extra boost to it. It gives you a little extra power. You will almost never see a guy throw a low kick that way in a kickboxing match because they're going to get punch countered. They're just going to get punched in the pocket.
Yeah.
Like you can't get away with that.
The only guys who kick from right in front of their opponent without moving first are guys who keep a very tight guard. Like Gokhan Saki does this a lot, where he'll catch a punch on his guard and then counter with a kick, kind of the kicking version of the catch and shoot counter system. But he does it with his guard really high and tight just to mitigate the chance of being caught while he's kicking.
Robin van Roosmalen too will do that a lot.
Absolutely.
So you either throw them as a counter or you throw them just in the pocket but with a tight guard, and they're not as hard, but you are more defensively sound while you're throwing them.
Now, if you want to throw a hard kick, you've got to step off. Maybe do you think maybe there's part of the reason we don't see this in MMA is because Joe Rogan has spent so many years maligning kickers who step before they kick?
I think that there is. I think that there is an argument to be made there, but I don't think it's Joe Rogan specifically. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of sense that that if you step, you're telegraphing.
Yeah,
and that's just not correct. Like,
which is the same as saying that if you change levels before you throw a body shot, you're telegraphing. I mean, maybe, but you're also putting yourself in the safest position from which to launch that attack.
Exactly, and like a lot of the time, I mean, if you just like if you just take a giant leap and throw a low kick, you are telegraphing that. If you throw 2 punches and then step into your low kick the way that Jose Aldo does, are you telegraphing your low kick or are you taking a good angle?
Yeah,
that's not it's not the same thing.
And at a certain point, isn't it worth telegraphing if the guy who now sees the opportunity to counter is no longer in a position to make that counter happen?
Exactly. Yeah,
I'd rather telegraph and yet be out of the way than expect the guy to not be able to react and keep myself in a risky position. Because at a certain point, the guy is going to see the kick coming one way or the other, and I'd rather be out of the way for him to hit me back.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that MMA strikers have somehow gotten the impression that a low kick is a relatively safe strike, and maybe it is.
Like it's a jab. Frank Shamrock. Yeah. This is Frank Shamrock's fault. I'll just say that. I love Frank Shamrock, but for years the guys at Frank Shamrock was telling people that the low kick was the MMA equivalent of a jab, which is not true. The jab is the MMA equivalent of the jab. You could argue that the teep works like a jab. A low kick is like throwing a lead hook. It's doable, but it puts you at risk. There's no way to throw a low kick without opening yourself up.
Exactly. And if you look at how expert low kickers throw their low kicks, it is almost like, you look at it, to come back to Ernesto Hoost, the example that we're looking at, for the example that started this whole conversation. Hoost always has multiple layers of defense to his low kicks. You know, in the same way that you pull your head offline when you throw a right hand to avoid a same time counter, you pull your head offline when you're throwing a low kick. And that does two different things. First of all, it gives a little extra oomph to your kick because you're scrunching, you're effectively activating your abdominal muscles and adding that force to your kick. Mm-hmm. So there's that. But also, by pulling your head offline, you are pulling your head to the left and you are getting your head outside of the path of the standard right hand counter.
Yes.
So you have that. You have the step, which again is taking you offline. It takes you outside the path of the right-hand counter. That's a lot of the time why we see left hooks to the body pair as the last punch in a combination before the low kick, because the correct angle for that body shot is going to be slightly outside that right hand to start with, or you're slipping as you're slipping to load your hips before you throw it.
Yeah.
So you're already out of that path. It makes it a nice, easy, logical follow-up shot.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you get yourself in the same position for the left hook, and then you throw the kick. The other thing that Hoost does is that he will often post his hand on the opponent's head or guard as he throws the kick. Mm-hmm. So in the same way that fighters who throw long knees really well, they will touch the opponent, either grab one of their gloves to negate it as a counter or cover it with their hand, and then put their other hand on their head, either to post and keep the guy off balance so he can't lunge forward with a counter, or actually to pull him down into the knee to break his posture. And Hoost would do that. He would manipulate their guard and their posture and their line of sight as he threw the kick. So throwing it in the same way you would a knee keeps himself safe, keeps the opponent... It literally frustrates any attempt the opponent might think of making to throw a counter, which is smart. You don't see a lot of guys... I mean, I guess that really ties into our kicking from the clinch. It's, you knee from the clinch, and you do a semi-clinch when you throw a knee from long range to make it safe. Why not do the same thing with your kicks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at the end of the day, a lot of what this comes down to is that you have a lot of different options for how to do this. And I think that MMA fighters, just by the nature of the sport, are not going to have time to learn all of them in the same way that a really professional striker will, right? Like, it's not reasonable to expect the same level of expertise for, A, because of time, and B, because you've got other shit to worry about in an MMA fight. Mm-hmm. With that said, it still could be done better. And, I think Joseph Valtellini, Glory Kickboxer, said in an interview that his coach taught him 6 different ways to throw a low kick, as in there are 6 different distinct variations on this. And, without thinking about it, I would say that seems like it's splitting hairs a little bit. But still, you do need to have multiple options for how to do this. And you look at Jose Aldo, who is, for my money, the best low kicker in MMA, and he does have multiple options. He has a lot of different ways that he throws them, different angles, different speeds, stepping, not stepping, throwing them as counters, throwing them off feints to get you to put your weight down on your lead leg, and then he kicks you. Like, he is a guy who has options and has different things available to him for low kicking. I would like to see a little bit more of that in MMA.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I think of, when you say that he has 6 ways to throw a low kick, I think of George Benton's famous quote that he had 48 counters to the jab in his arsenal. A very specific number and a very large number, and I think that's the key. We've gotten a lot into this Bruce Lee philosophy of, I fear the man who not the man who's trained to one kick or 1,000 kicks one time each or whatever. I don't know the quote. I'm butchering it.
I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks. I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times or something like that.
But I guess that does still make sense because, I mean, effectively, you're throwing the same leg kick. But as we said before, you're adjusting it so it works in various situations. You're adjusting it for the circumstances. So even if you have the one technique, you need to have multiple ways of setting it up and multiple ways of really changing that technique as it's executed to make sure that it lands cleanly.
Yeah, because there is we're starting to see more checking in MMA now, which I think is a kind of an interesting development in its own right that I imagine we'll talk about a little bit. But if you've never banged your shin off of somebody's kneecap, it's a really unpleasant experience. Even if you're wearing shin pads, it's really unpleasant.
Yeah.
That is, ask any novice Muay Thai practitioner what their first couple of months were like when they were constantly banging their shins off of knees and shins. And it's like you go home after every class with your shins just beaten to crap.
Yeah.
Like it is super unpleasant. Even for people whose shins are conditioned, it's unpleasant.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only even after your fight, it still hurts. It's only the adrenaline that helps you to ignore the fact that you're coming dangerously close to breaking your shin every time somebody stops one of your kicks.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one more break, and then we'll come back. We may have one or two more questions for you. So after this break... Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on, and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. And we're back. Pat just told me a very intimate secret. He's lying on his couch right now as we record, and I think that really fits the energy of this episode today, don't you, Pat?
I do. We're taking a nice, relaxed approach to things here.
Unprofessional is how other people would call it. Relaxed is a lot more flattering, so I'm going to stick with that. We've got some more questions for you. So let's delve once more, Pat, into the heavy bag.
Just watch as we get 17 different messages from people telling us that they hate the fucking sound effect. Because that's probably what's going to happen. Right?
Yeah, I only kept listening because I thought that was the last I was going to hear of that sound effect. And, boy, it didn't work out that way. Our next question, which one do we want to go with, Pat?
Let's talk about the shoulder roll.
Okay, so we have a question here from Joseph Namrika. Sorry, guys, if we're mispronouncing your names. At Joe_Jitsu89 on Twitter. By the way, I think that's copyrighted, Joe. I think that Joe Benavidez has Joe Jitsu trademarked. So
you better fix that before he comes after you and whips you with a piano key belt. Just saying, man. You know, we take no responsibility for this.
You think does Joe Benavidez wear a piano key belt?
He does, yeah. That is one of his trademarks.
Oh man!
Actually, I'm not sure if it's a literal trademark. I don't know, like where he stands on patent law, but yes, no, he is very fond of the piano key belt.
He has trademarked the nickname and the piano key belt.
Yeah. So correct yourself, Joe Jitsu. Correct yourself.
Yeah. Joe's question is, why do you think the shoulder roll defense is not more commonly used in MMA? I'm sure everybody knows what a shoulder roll is, but just so we're clear, we are talking, because I use the term roll to describe a dipping down, where you describe a U shape with your head, where you go down on one hip, you slide to the other side, and then you come back up. You like roll under a hook. A shoulder roll is where you use your lead shoulder to parry a punch. In the same way that you would slap a punch to the side with one of your gloves, as the punch passes by towards your chin, you catch it on your shoulder and you misdirect it with your shoulder. It's not the same as a shoulder block, where you might pull your head back and catch a punch on your shoulder. You are actually causing the opponent to miss and hopefully overextend so that you can then turn your body back the other direction and catch him with a counter right hand. And it's obviously the trademark of Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Floyd Mayweather Sr. and Roger Mayweather, the Mayweather boxing dynasty. Everyone except Jeff. Jeff Mayweather deliberately does not fight like his brothers. Very conventional boxing style for Jeff. But the Mayweathers are obviously the ones that were most known for this technique. Why is it not seen in MMA, Pat? What are your thoughts on that?
A lot like leg kicking in the clinch. I think it's because it's really hard to execute well. And it's hard for MMA fighters to find the time to put in the hours to learn to do it properly. So, like, a lot of the time when people talk about the shoulder roll defense, what they're really talking about is the stance itself, the shell, right?
Yeah. I call that the crab. The Mayweathers call that the crab. So I hate the term Philly shell.
Okay, so the crab. We'll just go with it. I don't want to get into a terminological argument.
Well, it's because they use it to refer to the Mayweather style. The Mayweathers are from Detroit. They're from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the term came from EA Sports. It came from Fight Night, the game series, where they just randomly decided it was called the Philly shell, and everyone's run with it, and I don't get it. So if we're talking about the stance, let's just call it the crab position, because historically in boxing, that's what the high right hand, left hand across the belly, that's what it's been called, is the crab.
So we have seen this in MMA a little bit. I can think of a couple of different guys who have tried to use that stance. Kevin Lee, who's a prospect, he's now fighting out of Extreme Couture, but he is from Detroit originally. He's I can't remember what his nickname is, but it's something Detroit related.
Motor City something, isn't it?
I believe so, yeah. So it was obvious that Lee, being from that area, was training under a boxing trainer who espoused that system.
He's the Motown phenom.
He is the Motown phenom. There we go. So Lee tried this in a couple of his pre-UFC fights. I remember him trying some variation on it when he fought a prospect named Mansour Barnoui, a very talented guy. And then he tried it in his UFC debut against Al Iaquinta, and he got dropped by an Iaquinta jab for his trouble. And then Robert Whitaker tried to do something similar to this when he fought Colton Smith. Mm-hmm. And I think that was because he was so concerned about Smith's takedowns and getting ground down by him that he just wanted to make sure that he had that underhook ready to go when Smith shot at all costs.
Yeah, and his wasn't even like a crab position. His was like that cocky Pernell Whitaker left hand. His left hand was literally laying on his hip. He was so worried about having that ready-made left underhook that he kept it as low as possible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But in both those cases, I mean, Whitaker ended up knocking Smith out, but he ate a whole lot of clean right hands from a really terrible striker. And Colton Smith, make no mistake, is a terrible striker.
Yeah.
And when Iaquinta dropped Kevin Lee with that shot, Iaquinta was not the striker then that he is even now a year later. He's much better now.
Yeah.
And so I think the simple answer there is that it's really hard to do well. Like, it's really hard to be good at using that stance and using the shoulder roll more specifically as a defensive technique.
Yeah, I would even posit that the shoulder roll itself is not really difficult. It's making it work in the context of a larger game. Because, I honestly, if you have an opponent stand in front of you and you say, okay, try to hit me with a straight right hand, and you roll and try to slap it aside with your shoulder, that's not that hard to do. I think anyone can really probably do it with a little bit of practice. The problem is then when they start to work around your shoulder, the shoulder roll does not put you in a position that works with most conventional boxing techniques. You have to be able to, everyone, like, for example, you can teach a striker to sprawl, but can you teach him to chain wrestle in the same amount of time? Not really. So he might be able to sprawl on that first double leg, but what happens when his back ends up against the fence, and then you start changing angles and you switch to the single, or you go to a high crotch, or you just slide up into the clinch and trip him? Once you start going to the things that happen after the first attack, it starts to get more difficult. So it's easy to catch a jab and then shoulder roll, but then what do you do for the left hook? What do you do if they go to your body? What do you do if instead of a straight right, they try to loop it up over your shoulder? Or what do you do if they go for a left hook to get around your shoulder from the other side? What do you do if you roll your shoulder and then they move to your left and suddenly they're standing behind you and you have to turn to face them while they hit you in the face? It's difficult to do in the context of everything else that can happen in a fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially the looping right hand thing is way more of a concern in MMA than it is in boxing.
Yeah.
Because guys practice it more because there's more room to use it. So there are a lot of MMA fighters who may not be awesome strikers, but they will throw a good overhand. Like Josh Koscheck, not a good MMA striker. He was in his prime, he was a decent one, but he always threw a nasty overhand right.
Yeah.
And it was a good punch for him. It was an effective punch, and he knew how to throw it well. It was the only punch he knew how to throw really well. And so, you may have guys who are otherwise bad strikers who still throw a shot that by its very nature works around what you have chosen as your primary mode of defense.
Right. And the boxing answer to that, I should say, by the way, the Floyd Mayweather Jr. answer to that, because this speaks to the difficulty of working this technique in and how it has to belong to a very specific system of other tactics. Floyd Mayweather and his uncle and his father are really the only ones who have used it as a very consistent defense with consistently effective results. It's not even common in boxing, you know? The crab position is very common, but the specific technique of the shoulder roll is not. And so the key to Floyd Mayweather's success with this and how he avoids the overhand right, which while still a way to get around his shoulder is not easy to land on him, is that his whole style, the Mayweather crab, is built around the idea of standing tall and leaning back, which is not really something you want to find yourself doing in boxing range in MMA. If you're going to move backwards, you want to step out of range, and preferably you want to get low and go from side to side so that you're in a nice balanced position. Floyd will often lay against the ropes and lean back, and his way to get away from the overhand is literally to stand there, wait for it to come, and to lay back on the ropes so it falls short. And if it ends up being a straight right, he'll shoulder roll and catch you with the counter right on the way back. But without the ability to lean and literally lay against the ropes and use the elasticity of the ropes to your advantage, that's not a good idea. And Floyd can afford to lean back and let you come right in, because then he can still slide into a clinch position and everything. In MMA, you would effectively be giving your opponent your hips, which is not always a great idea. And giving him your legs to kick. You're basically offering up a bunch of targets by repeatedly trying to put yourself in that position.
Yeah, I mean, you're offering up both legs. You're offering up the rear leg. You're offering up the rear leg kick, which we're starting to see more in MMA now, by leaning your head back and basically taking yourself out of position to fire the immediate counter as a guy steps across into a kick. You're giving up your lead leg too. It's especially dangerous from the perspective of that rear leg kick because so much of your weight is going to be down on that as you lean backwards.
Yeah,
so which makes a normally devastating technique. Even more so.
Now, we should say, I have seen it used in MMA once with great effect, and it obviously speaks to the specific tactical application. It has to be in the right circumstances. And I'm thinking of Bobby Green's fight with Pat Healy, where Bobby Green just masterfully rolled Pat Healy's hand off his shoulder over and over and over again and countered beautifully out of that position. And I think we have to look at very carefully because Bobby Green has tried this other times, like, for example, against the low-kicking machine that is Edson Barboza, and looked terrible. Really looked bad. So we have to look at how exactly it worked against Pat Healy. Pat's a guy with predictable boxing. He's not a bad boxer, but he's slow, and it's easy to see his strikes coming, and he tends to really fight in specific patterns of punches. He also doesn't possess very dangerous kicks. He's also not an explosive wrestler. He's a pretty decent chain wrestler. He's very grimy in his wrestling, but he does not have that kind of shot where he can blast you off your feet or hit you with a sudden trip or something like that if you expose your hips. So you're kind of free to lean back and expose other areas of threat because he's not going to capitalize on them. And
especially if you're Bobby Green and you're a very good defensive wrestler, like you have a lot of wrestling experience.
And very athletic too.
Yeah, and you're pretty confident that even if you give a guy your hips, you're a good enough defensive wrestler. And especially a lot of that comes down to the specifics of that wrestling matchup and Bobby Green's ability to just crank hard on an overhook.
Yeah, and that's where it's nice to be in that crab position too, as a default position, because with your left hand along your belly and your right arm tucked tight along the right side of your jaw, not only are you protected from punches from either side, but if a guy tries to get in on you, your hands are already inside, so you can dig underhooks very easily.
Yeah.
So if you do have the great defensive wrestling that Bobby Green does, you can stop it. But even then, that hasn't worked for Bobby Green against everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, and Edson Barboza had a lot of really salient answers for that.
Yeah,
it was clear that like Edson Barboza's striking coach at this point is Mark Henry, who's Frankie Edgar's striking trainer and has been for a long time. Mm-hmm. Mark Henry is a really sharp dude, and I'm sure he has thought about how to both use and defeat the shoulder roll in MMA. Yeah. He is exactly the kind of dude who would spend some time working on that and thinking about it just in case it ever came in handy.
Yeah, and let's be honest. If we look at Floyd Mayweather and his use of the shoulder roll, it's the most unique aspect of his game, so it gets a lot of play. People love to talk about it. But Floyd Mayweather is an incredible boxer, all things considered. He can do an entire fight without using his shoulder roll and just use his jab and nice combinations and his footwork and win the fight. And he uses a variety of other kinds of head movement, too. He rolls under hooks. He will roll and then pivot and escape and suddenly be behind you. His whole defensive game is very sound. So just because it's highlighted by the exclamation point of the shoulder roll does not mean that that is his style. And so we it's best to avoid overemphasizing the importance of the shoulder roll to his success.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point.
Yeah, so I think that's probably all the time we have for. We're dragging on here a little bit, but it was fun to answer the questions. I like being able to go through the backlog, as it were, and we really appreciate your guys' questions. If you have more that you want us to answer next week, make sure you either send them to us via email. You can email Connor at heavyhandspodcast.com, or send them to us on Twitter, or just put them out there on Twitter. You don't even have to tweet at us, as long as you tag them with hashtag HeavyBagQuestions. So this has been the Heavy Bag, and I guess this has also been an episode of Heavy Hands. Before we close out, do you have anything you want to plug, Sir Wyman?
I do. I have a couple of different things I would like to plug. I should have a top 10 prospect article coming out on SureDog.com this week, or possibly next week. My editor doesn't tell me these things. And then I have a top 10 article. Actually, no way. We don't need to go into that. We don't need to talk about that. But yeah, no, that's about all I got going. What are you doing this week, Connor?
What was it, Pat? Can you really not talk about it?
It's top 10 Hollywood crossovers. Like it was. I mean, I write what I'm told to write because I like money and I like getting paid. So, yeah. So I guess I've actually succeeded in bringing more attention to that article than had I just said exactly what it was from the outset.
Yeah,
without
absolutely.
Without any sort of trepidation about the whole thing. But let's move. Let's put the focus on somebody else. What are you writing?
If I were you, I would have just said, I also am doing an article on top 10 Hollywood crossovers. And what about you, Connor? I would have just mumbled the hell out of it.
That's what. Well, hindsight's 20/20.
What do I have coming out this week? Well, God, Mayweather Pacquiao. It's all Mayweather Pacquiao. Lots of videos coming out very, very shortly. I'm going to have a bunch of short technique videos, each focusing. The series is called Secret Weapons, and I'm kind of looking at some of the more underappreciated tactics of each fighter's game. So, for example, Manny Pacquiao's counter right hook, which is one of his most dangerous punches, and one that doesn't get a lot of attention from fans because obviously he's known for the straight left. And his roll counter, and Floyd Mayweather's sticky arms, as I call them, where he uses his punches to generate clinch offense. So I'm looking forward to doing those nice little tight focused videos. I've also got a couple of videos for people who don't really know why this matchup is as important as it is. A pair of videos called Everything You Need to Know About Manny Pacquiao and Everything You Need to Know About Floyd Mayweather. So those will be coming out soon as well. And I will do something on Chad Mendes versus Ricardo Lamas. I will do something on Al Iaquinta versus Jorge Masvidal. It's not a great month for fights, but there are some highlights. So there will be some MMA coverage, but by and large, it's a lot of Mayweather-Pacquiao, Pat. It's a lot of Mayweather-Pacquiao for the rest of the month.
So what you're saying is you're going to be really, really excited for us to talk about it multiple times on Heavy Hands, right?
I'm going to have so much fresh insight to offer.
that you've never poured into another article or video. Right?
Never. Yeah, I will be as excited for that as I have been for today's entire episode of this podcast. It'll be a high energy show. Boy, this is not the right way to end an episode. I'm so sorry, everybody.
On that note, something finer points of face punching.
Yeah, if you came here today for something, you came to the right whatever. This has been Heavy Hands.